All right.
Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We were working on some technical difficulties in the background. We're going to let the room fill up before we get started, just make sure that nobody misses anything important, including the introduction of Mr. Lee Parks. So I'm going to say hello as the room fills up. Lauren, Maggie McNally, Michelle, Minna, Nancy, Paige, Randy, Sarah Shilkey, Sean, Beth, Ellen. It's so nice to see all of you joining us. Allie, nice to see you again. I spoke with you last night, I believe. Hal, Dan from Smarter. That's awesome. Good to see you in here. Ooh, Blair from New Zealand. Fantastic to have you. It's so exciting to have you guys in here. I'm going to introduce Mr. Lee Parks, and we're going to get started as soon as the room is full. Jerry, Julie, Lynn, nice to see you in the room. Thank you so much for joining us here at Rev Talks for our first Rev Conference, Day 2. And it looks like we're pretty good to go. So I am going to introduce our next Rev Pro. Lee Parks is an internationally acclaimed motorcycle safety instructor, a trainer, curriculum developer, and program manager. Without further ado, because I could talk about this man all day, as he's a personal friend of mine, as well as a colleague, a peer, and somebody who I think a lot of us look up to, I'm going to leave the floor to Lee. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your expertise. I'm looking forward to this as much as everyone else is.
Great. Thank you, Brittany. Great to be a part of this. This seems to be the whole new world of motorcycle events these days. Even our motorcycle training nowadays has been being done over Zoom in terms of the classroom section. So for today's talk, we're going to kind of look at things a little differently from maybe those of us as consumers sort of look at riding. So much of us ride as kind of an escape to get away from all the sort of hustle and bustle of life and work and so forth. But trying to make it, bring it down to earth here. We all know that motorcycling is a dangerous sport. And as Peter Parker's uncle once said to him, with great power comes great responsibility. And so as motorcyclists, we need to take responsibility as well for our own safety. So what I'm going to talk about today is what we call creating a culture of safety. And that includes rider education, that includes licensing, that includes lifelong learning and the decisions that we make as we choose to ride our motorcycles or not and so forth. So let's start by really defining what exactly is a cultural change. This is a word that you sometimes hear in various different industries, but let's start with a definition from our friends at Merriam-Webster. Cultural change is a modification of a society through innovation, invention, discovery, or contact with other societies. So before we understand the motorcycle industry, let's take a look at some of the cultural changes that have happened both in the health and safety worlds outside of motorcycling. First one would be smoking. We all remember, those of us that are old enough, growing up in high school, there was sort of the smoking section, right? You had to leave the building to go smoke. For those people who were smokers, we used to, in California here, if you would go out to a bar or even a restaurant, there were smoking sections, or the whole place was for smoking. Now you can go almost everywhere and not have to deal with smoking if you don't want to. So the relationship of the culture to smoking has completely changed in terms of people who don't smoke. Same thing with helmet use, especially if you look in the world of skiing, snowboarding, or even bicycling. Nobody used to wear helmets back in the day for any of those things. And now you'll notice that a lot of cities have ordinances where you have to wear a helmet if you're even going to ride a bicycle at any age. And certainly skiing and snowboarding, now it's very commonplace to see almost everybody wearing helmets, but it wasn't that long ago that nobody wore helmets. Seatbelt use, something we don't even talk about anymore. It's just something that now is done. When you look at some of the racing organizations on the car side, like the NHRA or NASCAR, well, both of those organizations kind of sprouted out of illegal racing on the street. And when it became a real health problem, they said, okay, look, we know you want to have fun. If you're going to do this, we're going to put it in a closed course. More recently, we saw that with the stunting world, right? Stunters used to do everything out on public streets. Now they have special events and closed courses for that. Drinking and driving, that used to be something that was just a normal thing that, that people did. Now it's very rare to see people really mixing those two in the way that they used to. Hitchhiking, when was the last time, if ever, anyone that's listening to this broadcast ever hitchhiked? Probably never for a lot of us, but that used to also be very commonplace. Even the use of condoms in terms of reducing diseases in pregnancy, you know, that's just sort of the normal thing right now. And probably something that we don't think about, but I think everybody experiences every day, is what we call the Nutrition Facts Panel. Back in 1994 with the Truth in Labeling Act, they made it so if you were going to buy something to eat, you had to know what the contents were. You had to know the number of calories, the amount of fat, carbohydrates, etc. So these are all cultural changes that have happened in the worlds of health and safety outside of motorcycling. So when we talk about building a safety culture, what exactly does that mean? What is a safety culture? Well, a safety culture is a broad organization-wide approach to safety management. Now that's kind of a mouthful, so let's kind of try to break that down. Well, first off, the organization could be as big as a country, a region, a state. It could be as small as a club, or even just a group of friends. And the idea here is that the end result of all the combined individual and group efforts towards values, attitudes, goals, and the proficiency of a safety program. So that's what we're trying to do, is get everybody basically on the same page. So let's take a look at what kind of a difference can a cultural change in a motorcycle safety program make. And for that, we're going to use California as an example. So we took over as Total Control Training, we took over the California Motorcycle Safety Program in January of 2015. And what's now known as the Great California Experiment. We said, hey, we've had an increase in fatalities. You can see in this particular graphic here, the previous 5 years, every year had a 12.1% year-on-year increase in fatalities. And since we took over the program management and the curriculum, we've had an average 1.1% decrease each year. Now that may not seem like such a big deal, but if you take that 12.1% year-on-year increase of the previous 5 years and you put that towards the 4 years that we have data for here, that means in 2018 alone, there would be another 252 dead people. And remember, when we're talking about people dying in motorcycle accidents, it's not just those people that get affected. It's everybody that those people relate to that get affected, the family members, the friends, coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is really life and death kind of stuff. And there are many factors that go into these types of things, but one of the most interesting is that the number of registrations and endorsements has remained basically constant over the last 5 years, yet we completely reversed the fatality trends. So to be able to understand how we did that, we need to first understand that the most difficult challenge in changing this culture of safety on the motorcycle side is not just a change in the curriculum or the training methodology, but really a major shift in the riders' attitudes towards it. And I'm also going to add the instructors as part of that. So to understand why that is, think about how much bikes have changed in the last 40 years. So I'll make it easy for you. A high-performance motorcycle 40 years ago was the Suzuki X6 Hustler. Now, I had actually bought one of these many years ago to do some ARMA vintage racing. And so the first thing I did was to look up a bunch of old motorcycle magazine reviews to see, you know, kind of what they had to say about it at the time, to see where I needed to start with making improvements to it. And it's very rare that I read something and it just sort of burns into my memory. But something happened, I don't remember which magazine it was, but there was an article I read reviewing the X6 Hustler, and I just read it once, and those words will forever be a part of my memory. And this is what it said. It said the Suzuki X6 Hustler does the quarter mile in a scorching 14.9 seconds. Clearly, this is not a bike for beginners. Now, a lot of you are probably laughing when you hear those words because they sound so ridiculous. It's hard to find a bike that's even that slow these days, 14.9 seconds in the quarter mile. Yet at that point, that was considered to be so fast, beginning riders shouldn't actually ride one of those things. Well, nowadays, maybe the modern equivalent would be a BMW S1000RR. This is a motorcycle with over 180 horsepower. This is a bike that does a quarter mile in the 9s, that has a top speed that MotoGP bikes not that long ago couldn't achieve. And this is a stone stock street motorcycle. Now, the human condition has not changed in the last 40 years, but what has changed is our expectations of what we expect a new rider to be able to control or to handle. And to illustrate this even further, my previous new bike, Brittany will laugh, she bought one of them after riding my bike. It was a Triumph Street Triple R. And I was so attached to that bike when I first got it. And I've always been someone who's been pretty friendly with folks in terms of letting them ride my bikes and so forth. So sure enough, I let one of my good friends test ride the bike, someone who I knew was safe, someone who I knew no matter what I did, they would take good care of my baby. And who was it that actually ended up totaling my Street Triple R, but none other than Mr. Safety, David Huff, the author of Proficient Motorcycling, the book and the series. I mean, if there's ever anyone you should be able to trust with your motorcycle, it's David Huff. Well, what happened? Well, for the previous few years before riding that bike, he had been riding a Can-Am Spyder pretty much exclusively. And if those of you guys have ever driven one of those three-wheeled vehicles, you'll notice that they have no front brake lever. They have only a foot brake that controls both the front and the rear brakes. Well, after 3 years of riding no motorcycles or no vehicles with hand front brakes, he got on a basically racetrack spec Street Triple R with super modern, incredibly efficient brakes. And as soon as he grabbed his first handful of those, he flipped over the handlebars, ended up doing a somersault, landing on his back, totaled the bike. And so this goes to show you, even someone who's incredibly skilled, an instructor, someone who's taught on the subject for years, even someone like that, as technology changes, may have difficulty in being able to adapt to it. So when you think about it, riding a modern motorcycle is really closer to flying an airplane than it is to driving a car. And the reason I bring that up is when you think about what it takes to get your private pilot's license, it is much more rigorous than getting your motorcycle endorsement, right? We can do motorcycle training in 2 days and give someone the ability to ride any motorcycle, no matter how fast, how big, and so forth. So you'll notice you never hear passengers of commercial flights complaining about having high standards for airline pilots, right? You never hear anyone say, gee, I wish we would just make it easier for airline pilots to be able to get their licenses, right? Nobody ever complains about that because the penalty for failure is so high. So when we talk about the best pilots, let's take a look at, say, fighter pilots. We have what I call the fighter pilot dilemma, which is how do we get people who have never flown before up to the pinnacle of performance? How do we get them to be able to fly the most high performance aircraft that we have? Well, in the Air Force, they have a saying. They say there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And one of my goals is to make sure all of you guys become old pilots. So to do that, both of us subscribe to the crawl, walk, run philosophy of training. So just like you would have to start flying, learning how to fly a Cessna before you could ever dream of flying an F-16, that's just the starting point. Beginner training, no matter where you take it anywhere in the world, is really just a starting point for modern motorcycles. It certainly doesn't prepare you to operate the high-performance sport bikes, heavyweight cruisers, touring bikes, adventure bikes, etc., that most people are going to want to go out and buy. Similar instructor trainings are just a starting point for motorcycle instructors. It takes years to become a really proficient motorcycle instructor. So one of our goals is to be able to get riders to realize how much skill it takes to really safely operate a modern motorcycle. The first realization is that motorcycles are much more complicated than cars to be able to control with real precision. They also have much more severe consequences should you make a mistake, because we don't have cages around us to help protect us. Not just the consequences for the rider, but as I mentioned earlier, their family, their friends, their coworkers, other riders. So we've all heard people say, hey man, I've been riding for 20 years. I'm a good rider. Well, maybe they're a good rider. Maybe they're not such a good rider. Do they really have 20 years of experience of getting better? Or do they really just have that 1 year of experience that they've repeated 20 times over again? So people like to say that practice makes perfect, but practice doesn't actually make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Only perfect practice makes perfect. And the only way that you know what perfect practice is to have a definition for what defines proper techniques. Another issue we have is that a lot of riders think that most bike crashes are the car driver's fault, but that's actually not true. In fact, in over 95% of fatal motorcycle crashes, the motorcycle is the striking vehicle. meaning the motorcycle is what hit whatever the object was that caused the crash. That includes single vehicle accidents where the motorcyclist hits the ground. Now, there are times certainly where the car driver turns in front of the rider, turns left in front of the rider. But my question to them would be, how good are the riders' braking skills? What if the tide is tighter than anticipated? We've all come into corners only to discover, oh, this thing got a lot tighter than I thought it was when we started. And let's be honest, every one of us has ended up on the wrong side of that double yellow line before, and we're only here because there wasn't a semi-truck coming at the same time. So I would ask that rider, do you know how to increase traction and ground clearance with your different riding techniques? A lot of crashes and fatalities are, quite frankly, our faults. They're the result of poor braking and cornering skills of us, the riders. In other words, we're doing it to ourselves. So in a car, they do a lot of the work for us with ABS, traction control, etc. Motorcycles are just really starting to incorporate these things into them. But on a bike, you need to have very specific skills that must be correct. You must be able to execute them quickly, and they have to be very well practiced. Now, I want to set a call out to the people who are going to be able to fix this change of culture that we need, this creating a culture of safety. And we like to call them the twopers. What are the twopers? The twopers are the 2%ers. Now, when you hear something like 2%ers, you might think of those outlaw motorcycle gangs. That's not those kind of 2%ers. When I say twopers, I'm talking about what we would call the super enthusiasts, right? Now, what are their defining characteristics? Well, number one, these are usually people who are early adopters of both bike and riding technologies. In other words, they keep a very open mind towards new technology. These are people who are not afraid to take risks, right? Part of the joy of motorcycling, as strange as it sounds to people who don't ride, is that it's not without risk. And those include physical risks, financial risks, social risks. We also, those of us that what I would call twopers or super enthusiasts, we have a constant thirst for knowledge and skills. In the military, they call them SMEs, SMEs, for subject matter experts. We also seem to, for some reason, take a joy out of helping others. All of us that are presenters here, all of you guys that are listening, for some reason, we seem to take satisfaction in helping other people get better in their motorcycle riding. We also would have what I would call a relentless pursuit of proficiency. And part of that means we enjoy being both a student when we're learning from people and also being an educator when we're helping share that information with other people. We also, a lot of us we personally perform a real large majority of our bike maintenance. Now, I'm not talking about taking apart transmissions or things like that, but for sort of basic maintenance, people who are real enthusiasts take a real active interest in that. Partially because if your motorcycle breaks, you're the one who pays the price if things don't go well. These are also people who are committed to what we call ATGAT, all the gear, all the time. Brittany is the poster child for ATGAT. And these are also often opinion leaders of their riding or social groups, including these days, online groups, which are the majority of a lot of our social groups. So why are these people critical? Well, they're critical because in terms of creating a culture of safety, because we're willing to take risks that others will not. So as an example, many years ago when I got my first big contract to do motorcycle training, it was for the Marine Corps. And after doing a sample class for them, they basically said, listen, we really love the class. It was the best advanced course we've ever taken, but you require that motorcyclists wear pants in your class. I said, yes, that's correct. This is an advanced course. Sometimes people go down. We want to make sure they're protected. They said, well, is that a deal breaker for you? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, if we're not going to require the Marines to wear pants, would you literally walk away from this? And I took a really deep breath and I realized that this next decision could affect the rest of my entire life. And I said, unfortunately, it is, in fact, something I would walk away from. And as much as I really want this business, I value Marine skin as much as I do civilian skin. And yes, if you're not willing to make them wear pants, then yeah, I can't be a part of this. They were like, fine, we'll make them wear pants. Woo! Oh my God, that was the first six-figure motorcycle contract I ever got and almost lost. And I am so happy that I stuck to my guns, even though I took the ultimate financial risk of being able to walk away. And similarly, we invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in R&D for a new beginner curriculum for the California contract that we started developing in 2012, not even knowing if anyone would ever want this. And we were very, very lucky that that risk came back to us in getting the contract in January of 2015. And as we've shown earlier, the results have been really impressive. In 1994, I decided I wanted to race professionally. And although I was a starving motorcycle journalist, I really thought this may be the only opportunity to ever do this. And it took me 5 years to get out of debt from that 1 year just to be able to race professionally. We also push the limits on riding motorcycles. And we do that in order to be able to raise them. In other words, we take these physical risks. You've recently seen there are people doing triple backflips now on motorcycles. I remember when no one was even doing a single backflip on a BMX bike. Now they're doing 3 backflips on motorcycles. We're also not afraid to stand out from the crowd. We take social risks in terms of our self-expression, what we say, how we dress, how we accessorize our motorcycles. So Tupers are also visionaries for a better future, right? Selfishly, we want to maximize our fun and minimize our risk. And we understand the nuances of being a motorcyclist better than a typical bureaucrat does, which is why it's important to have them in state motorcycle safety programs. We're also catalysts for change. And ultimately, the Tupers are the socially connected, what we call the cool kids or the trendsetters. And because of that, they have leadership skills. They lead by example. They can be positive or negative. They're well respected in their groups. And they also like to encourage other people to be all that they can be. So some of the proven drivers of change that we've been able to achieve these reductions in fatalities have been raising the standards for student licensing. So we require that they have more proficiency. For instance, we don't limit how many points they get off for braking. If they do a really poor job in braking, they can literally fail the course for that. And where this was really made sort of real for us was we did a comparison at Camp Pendleton where we took the same 3 months of the same types of students, Marines, and we compared their braking skills from the previous curriculum to the new one. They went from 0.612 Gs the last year of the old curriculum to 0.835 in the new one. So what that means to the real world is at 15 miles an hour, these students were stopping 3.3 feet shorter. That's the difference between hitting a bumper or not. At 30 miles an hour, that's 13.2 feet shorter. That's a car length. At 60 miles an hour, not a high speed, 52.9 feet shorter. That means the day they leave class, they can literally stop almost a semi-truck. They can stop almost a semi-truck shorter than they could compared to the previous one. We've also had lower pass rates, which is what's to be expected. People that barely passed the old one now have an opportunity to decide riding is not for them, or conversely, that they need to come back and get more training before they're going to be safe. Similarly, we raise the standards for instructor licenses. So part of that is also promoting and offering both intermediate and advanced training. Because if we don't fix all the existing riders that are out there and we just train more new riders, we're going to make the base of the pyramid bigger and the fatalities are going to go up. And in the various departments of the military, they've had a 37 to 61% reduction in fatalities by requiring follow-on training. They like to say that they're voluntold to be there. Well, interestingly, the largest state programs in terms of doing advanced training, California and Pennsylvania, we each do about 1,000 students a year in advanced training. But there's 1.5 million endorsements in California, 800,000 in Pennsylvania. So we're still only touching just a tiny percentage of the existing riding population. And when we've surveyed instructors nationally, over half of them have never even taken an advanced level course. How are they going to convince other riders it's important to do it when they themselves aren't willing to do it? So this is my challenge to all of you for this year. The first one is, we all know the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? So what I want to know is, what are you going to do differently this year versus last year in regards to, number one, improving your personal skill set. That could be different courses that you take. That could be books that you read, videos. I mean, YouTube has been just a cornucopia of all kinds of new ideas to be able to improve your riding. Also, practice, practice, practice. The same 3 rules of real estate: location, location, location. No matter what you learn or how you learn it, they don't do you any good in a panic situation unless you practice those things over and over until you've trained them into what a sports psychologist would call your muscle memory. Another thing I want to see you do differently this year versus last year is really define your relationship between impairment and riding. In other words, when are you going to cut off drinking before you ride a bike? An hour before, 2 hours, 8 hours before? Drugs, not just prescription drugs, but over-the-counter drugs. Distraction. This is now one of the biggest things I think that all the new technology in motorcycling has really affected us in that between our GPSs and our cell phones and our radar detectors and our music in our helmets, there are so many different ways for us to be distracted that can take away from our ability to be safe. Also, things as simple as fatigue or hunger. Those are also types of impairment that can affect our ability to ride. Riding gear choices. You know, is the riding gear that you used last year still the best that you can afford to be able to keep yourself safe? If not, you should really look from helmets to boots and everything in between. What kinds of riding gear choices can you make that are going to give you a better ability to mitigate those dangers better in 2020 than you did last year? And overall, I want you to look at it from the 30,000 foot view. What, when, where, and how you ride, as well as who you ride with. So sometimes you can just have a bad influence of riding with someone, for instance, who you know rides over their head or who rides a little too fast for conditions. And it's very easy to get sucked into wanting to follow behind them and keep up with them so that you don't look like you're not the tough person or whatever it is. So even choosing who you ride with, I want you to really consider, are the people that you normally ride with or that you're willing to ride with the same people that you want to ride with next year? Ultimately, all of these different things, when you look at them in their totality, you know, think about what are you going to do differently this year versus last year to help create a safety culture in your sphere of influence, whether that sphere is just your best friend, whether that is a state program, whether that's on a national, or some people, some of our YouTube friends, they have international audiences. So what are you guys going to do differently this year versus last year to help create that safety culture in your sphere of influence? And with that, I would like to go ahead and open it up to some questions. All right. So David Hall asked, considering the two bike comparison you did earlier, what is a good bike for beginners? Well, that's a really good question. It also depends very much on your size. For instance, if you're 6'6", the right choice of a bike, whether you're a beginner or not, is going to be very different than if you're 4'6", for instance. And we've had students that are both of those. So the first thing is a bike that fits you physically, regardless of what size you are. You want a bike that sort of matches your size. And you want something, generally lighter weight is going to be better for starting out than heavier weight. Just like it's easier to drive a small economy car than it is to drive a semi-truck. You wouldn't want to start out in the equivalent of a semi-truck. And also something that doesn't have so much horsepower or something that's so touchy on the throttle. Even some of the electric bikes now have so much torque right off of throttle. Even when they don't have a ton of horsepower, they can be very difficult to control. So something that has both lighter weight and an amount of horsepower that you feel comfortable controlling, but it's really going to depend. You've got a bunch of choices that are cruisers, that are adventure bikes, sport bikes, standards, even touring bikes now, you're getting smaller and smaller sizes. Same thing on the scooter side. So anyway, I think that that is a question that you've got to look at how you fit on the bike, but certainly something that is not going to be too heavy or too fast initially. So we've got a question from Dan Pedersen. Lee, what are your thoughts regarding changing state licensing requirements? Is learning to ride like learning to fly? If you look at how they do, I really do like the aviation example. And in aviation, they have what they call check flights. So if you learn to fly a Cessna, if you want to get certified to fly that, you have to pass your test in a Cessna. If you want to get, say, certified in a twin-engined Bonanza, you're going to have to get another check flight, and someone's got to approve you in that. You want to do a single-engine jet, et cetera, all the way up to multiple-engine commercial airliners. So I think ultimately, if I was boss, I would love to see check rides. In other words, where you would get licensed for the vehicle that you can successfully pass the test in. And I would like to see more stiffer testing standards as well. But if you can pass it on a GSXR 1000, great. You can ride that. You can own one of those. If you can't pass it on that, you have no business being on the road. Another question, TUPERs don't seem to be organized like SMROs. What ideas do you have about TUPERs leading the culture change if there is no organization? Well, the motorcyclist rights organizations, if you look at them in general, they typically if you look historically, they've mostly been, sadly, about getting rid of helmet laws. And I personally am helmet law agnostic. I don't fight for them. I don't fight against them, but I am pro helmet use. And so I think if the motorcyclist rights organizations start to change a little bit in terms of appealing more to the sport bike riders, the off-road riders, the people who maybe have different brands than make up the majority of their members, I think that's still, I think the motorcyclist rights organizations are still the best way to do it. Either we need some new ones, or the existing ones, I think, need to sort of change their marketing tactics and their optics in a way that you're going to get more of those tupers joining them. So Blair wrote, I wear leather all the time now, but aside from just being the example, what other advice do you have for encouraging good gear? Well, certainly you want to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. No question about that. But we've all been sort of stopped, those of us that wear full gear at, say, restaurants or gas stations, and people will look at you as you're, sort of sweating in your gear or whatever it is, and they'll say, man, aren't you hot in that? You're like, yeah, I am hot in that. But what I like to say is, but you know what's even hotter? What's much hotter than wearing gear on my motorcycle on a day like today is when you're sitting there on the table under those really bright LED lights as they're scraping the rocks and the dirt and the tissue off of you from that horrible crash. That is much, much hotter than anything I'm experiencing right now. And so really just unabashedly being happy that that's the choice that you make. And when people ask, engage them in a sort of honest, open way, including the negatives, like, yes, it is hot sometimes, or it is a little bit more difficult to see or breathe, or whatever it is that they think the issues are. Those of us that wear gear, whether it's ventilated gear, whether it's gear that we're able to use evaporative cooling, whether it's gear that has things to help keep the sweat coming off you, know that you can actually be more comfortable with gear than without gear. And especially on really, really hot days, that's the case. John wrote, you described a higher percentage of student failures recently. What do you think happens to those students? Do they try again, quit riding, take state DMV, etc.? So it really depends. We actually have a fairly low percentage of people who ultimately fail. So in other words, we have a significantly higher percentage of people who fail the test the first time, but the vast majority of those people come back, retake the class, and pass it the second or even occasionally the third time. So the total number of people that are leaving us is really no different than it was before. The difference is the people that were higher risk are now being motivated to come back for a second or every once in a while a third set of training before they realize themselves that they're safe to pass. So I don't think that they're just disappearing after that. Based on the total number that we get back coming in for a second time to retake the class, I think we might even be doing slightly better than previously in terms of the total number of ultimate failures. But in that first time they take the class, that number has increased significantly. Let's see. Do you find value in allowing kids to learn on dirt bikes or mini bikes before they grow up into adult riders? This is something I feel very passionately about. I started riding when I was 12. I started, believe it or not, ice racing and then motocross racing when I was 14. And I learned all the important lessons of riding a motorcycle in terms of respecting the machine, being able to work on it, wearing protective gear, respecting others, etc., the hard way on the dirt at relatively low speeds without high-speed cars, trucks, drunk drivers, etc. I think there is no better way for anyone, kid or adult, to learn than to start on the dirt before they ever go ahead and ride on the streets. There is no margin for error on the street. Sometimes, even when you do nothing wrong, someone cuts into your lane, doesn't see it, doesn't stop, et cetera, et cetera. So especially for kids, I think that not only is it going to make them better street motorcycle riders when they get into that, but it's also going to make them much more aware car drivers, even if they choose not to ride on the street and just ride their dirt bikes off-road. I can't think of a better way than people riding dirt bikes to help learn those things. All right. Do you have any recommendations as to how to achieve perfect practice? So that's a great question from Jerry Cassidy. So the best way to be able to define perfect practice is to take a very well-respected advanced riding school. There are many good ones all over the country that do that. Some do them on the street, some do them in ranges, some do them on the dirt, some do those on racetracks. But in those places where you've got highly trained instructors, some of us have written books or you'll see videos and so forth. But once you've taken those classes, they will teach you the things that you're supposed to do, none of which you will master when you're in these classes. But by taking really good notes of what those ideal techniques are, that's going to give you the best chance of knowing how to replicate that perfect practice. Okay. What will it take to get subsequent rider training participation up beyond beginner training? Well, I can tell you where we've been successful is I think the biggest problem with most beginner training is the riders that take that beginner training, and this is one of the big things we addressed, which is why we created our own beginner training curriculum, is if the student does not have a great experience in their beginner training course, meaning they don't feel like they not only learned a lot, but more importantly, that there's still a lot more to learn. I think a big problem with a lot of beginner training is students leave there with a false sense of confidence because too often the instructors are being more of cheerleaders than they are of being critical educators to let them know not just what they've been successful, but the kinds of areas where they need to improve. And if a student doesn't, number one, have fun in the class, they're not going to want to take advanced training. If they don't feel when they leave there like there's much more for them to learn, they're not going to take follow-on training. So really it just comes down to the experience they have in the beginner course. If the instructors, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, if the instructors have not done multiple advanced courses themselves, in fact, if they've never done any follow-on training, how would they possibly motivate a student to want to take additional training themselves? After all, they are the subject matter expert. They are the person that the student is trying to be, that future motorcyclist. If that instructor doesn't feel like advanced training is valuable, there's no way that the student is going to feel that way. So really it comes to improving the beginner training classes that the students are taking. And like I say, at least in Total Control, that's been the big sort of point of differentiation for us, is that we're brutally honest with the students, not just about the good stuff, but about the bad stuff. We require all of our instructors every year take advanced training courses and get better both in their riding as well as in their teaching. And we make it clear to the students that the best riders are not the riders who are one and they're done. The best riders are the ones who never stop learning. But if the beginning instructors don't embody that, there's no way that the students are going to be able to do that. All right. What role do you think various motorcyclist clubs can play in terms of a safety culture? Well, that's a really good question from Helen. I'll use the best example that I know of, which are the two big BMW clubs, the BMW MOA, Motorcycle Owners Association, and the BMW RA, Riders Association. So something very interesting has happened in these two big BMW clubs, and that is they have made a culture of safety part of the club. So for instance, if you show up to one of these BMW events and you are not wearing really good safety gear, the rest of the members there will do the equivalent of, if you ever saw Full Metal Jacket, what they call a pillow party, right? They will make it pretty clear that that behavior is not welcome there. They're not going to literally attack them, but verbally they're going to make them feel pretty stupid for showing up without that gear. Similarly, they really value follow-on training. They even give scholarships to different training. They do reviews of training constantly in their two magazines. And so basically what they've done is they've made it so that the cool kids are wearing gear, the cool kids are getting advanced training. Those are the kinds of things that if you get the top management to do it. So probably the best example I've ever seen is in Texas. The Banditos are one of those 1%er clubs, one of those outlaw motorcycle gangs. And the president in Texas, his son died, who was also a member. His son died of a traumatic brain injury when he crashed without wearing the helmet. And what the president did is he basically said, he just took a stand. He said, listen, I know a lot of you guys don't wear helmets, but starting right now, if you are wearing your colors, you will be wearing a full face DOT compliant helmet, or you will not ride with your colors. And that very next week, every single one in Texas, you'll see them. They wear these matte black full face helmets, and every one of them wears it. And it wasn't a choice. It wasn't something that, well, they had a choice. They had a choice to either wear the helmet or not wear their colors. And since not wearing their colors wasn't an option, one person taking a stand, the president of that club, said, I'm not going to lose another brother the way that I lost my son. And for that reason, you're all going to wear helmets or you're not going to be part of the club. And so all we have to do is get to those opinion leaders. In this case, one guy changed the culture of an entire club, unfortunately due to a really tragic accident. Look at Brittany Morrow as an example. You know, her entire life stance was reinvented when she had a horrible, horrific accident. Most people would have sworn off motorcycles for life. What did she do? She became the ultimate safety advocate. Not only did she start Rock the Gear, not only did she start Rev Talks, but she does presentations all the time. That's how I first met Brittany. Her and I did a presentation together at Fort Knox in Kentucky. And that was back in 2007. And so all of us are here, you know, and in one sense, it's a little silly because we're all sort of preaching to the choir here. Hopefully you've picked up a few new things during this presentation that will help you do a better job of preaching to the not choir. And, you know, not just leading by example, but giving them tools that they'll be able to use to continue to create that culture of safety outside of us. We've started that process in California. The BMW clubs have done that nationwide, at least in the US. I don't know about the other countries. And organizations like Rev Talks, like Rock the Gear, all of these different, Smarter, Dan Pedersen's organization, all these organizations that are dedicated to safety. I think one of the biggest keys is not limiting ourselves to preaching to the choir and being able to figure out the olive branches we can use to work cooperatively with the motorcyclist rights organizations. You know, that includes the AMA, that includes all the abates, it includes the MRF, et cetera. There's local ones everywhere. But basically trying to make motorcycling as well as the MROs much more inclusive of all types of riders and bikes and not just representing one small demographic. So Brittany, I think I'm out of time. Do you want to take over here or do I just keep talking? Okay.
You're good to go. You have 5 more minutes, Lee, if you want to kind of search through the Q&A real quick and see if there's a couple of questions that you are willing to answer over the next 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for continuing to impress me every time I watch your presentation. I've seen this one so many times, and yet it's new every time. So we got about 5 more minutes. Now we have 4 minutes, so you're on the spot.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Okay. Am I supposed to unshare my screen now? Or keep going?
I already did it for you. You're welcome.
You did it for me. Okay. Thank you. All right. So what is my opinion on lane splitting? Should there be some training on how to safely lane split? I live in a state that doesn't allow it. So when I do lane split, I'm not confident and I'm not exactly sure what to look out for to be safe. So that is an excellent question. I am very fortunate to live in California in terms of that lane splitting is allowed. I can tell you everybody when they first move here really doesn't know sort of what to think about it because it just seems so strange and awkward when you're not used to it. When you go to Europe, when you go to Asia, and lane splitting is just the norm. In fact, if you've seen the crazy videos from Vietnam, etc., you know, just you don't even know how these people make it to their destinations in one piece. I just recently came back from a trip doing motorcycle training in the Philippines, and I have to admit, even me who's been lane splitting for, you know, since 1992 was really intimidated by the unbelievable craziness that is lane splitting out there. In the California Motorcycle Safety Program, we do have lane splitting guidelines and tips that we put out for our riders. We also have them available. In fact, if anybody wants to send me an email, I will be happy to send you a copy of the tips that we have for that. What we don't know is in states where it's not allowed, we don't know what it's going to take to train car drivers to be dealing with it. I think it's pretty easy to train motorcyclists how to lane split safely. It's not so easy to get car drivers to understand it. So for instance, if you're a child in California growing up, for me, it would have been in the back seat of a station wagon, as many of you, and you just get used to, as you're driving wherever, to seeing motorcyclists slowly sort of passing you on the sides. Lane splitting is just a normal part of traffic. But if you grew up in a state that doesn't have that, like I grew up in Illinois, it would be totally bizarre to have people doing that. And so a California kid who grows up and then becomes 16 and gets their license, it's not a huge deal for them to deal with lane splitters because they grew up with it. So I think the real challenge, and Utah is the first state since California to allow it in a very limited format. They don't let you do it on the highways, but they do allow a certain amount of it. They're going to be the first state to really learn what do they need to do in terms of educating the car drivers. They've done a bunch of public service announcements out there. And so we're all really excited to sort of see how does that affect the traffic accidents. The study that was done by UC Berkeley showed that when lane splitting was done at the recommended guidelines that we give out, that it was actually safer for motorcyclists than not lane splitting. But once you go above those guidelines, it is more dangerous. Seems also like pretty much common sense, but that's where those guidelines came from. And last question here, what recommendations can you make for refresher courses for riders with 20 years of bad habits to break? So that's an excellent question, Barbie. Obviously, if full disclosure, I'm going to certainly recommend our Total Control intermediate riding clinics and advanced riding clinics. But every state has both programs inside the state program as well as without. There's a lot of really great police-style motorcycle training classes. They can be anything from a half a day to as long as 2 weeks. Those are really good for low-speed precision maneuvers. I recommend quite a few of those. I also have a full list, well, not a full list, but I have a list at the time in 2014 when I wrote the second edition of my book, Total Control, that has a list of a whole bunch of classes that I do personally recommend. There's plenty of other good ones that I just haven't taken or have come out since then, but that would be one thing to go sort of look at that list. If you've got local riding clubs, talk to the people that, see what classes they've taken that they've had value in. I try not to recommend personally classes that I haven't actually taken, which doesn't mean that they're not good classes. They may be fantastic classes, but if I'm going to make a personal recommendation, it's generally something that I will have done. I also highly recommend, especially for people 20 years, whatever it is, that any kind of off-road training is going to be valuable. Learning how to control a bike as you get over the limits of traction and back, you can't put a price on that. We don't want to be learning those things on our street bikes. But on a low-speed dirt bike, they can be very low-powered. They don't have to be fast. It's better if they're not high-powered dirt bikes. You can really get comfortable learning how to control your motorcycle in adverse traction conditions. So I would highly recommend looking out for your local off-road training classes. There's so many different ones, I couldn't list them all. But Brittany's giving me that eye. It's time to go. So
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you so much for your expertise, your insight, and the challenge that you just put out to everyone. I hope that Rev Talks can be a part of this hub for tupers. I'm so always impressed with you, and I know everyone else in the audience is as well. Thank you so much for participating in our first Rev Conference.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual. Enjoy, everyone.
Yep. If Lee did not get to your question, we will give him a rundown of the Q&A, and he can actually follow up via email with you. So if you have your last minute questions, you can get them in real quick. We have a 9-minute break coming up before we go on to our next presentation, which will be our podcasters panel discussion. So stick around for that. Get a little bit of a break in you, stand up, walk around, stretch, and then come back for more. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you in 9 minutes. Bye.